my English name is Sylvester Sahme Sr., but my own Indian name is Watikshnaket. And I was named after my grandmother's grandfather, who was chief of the Thai Valley Taichpans. So that's where the name comes from, and that's who I am. But I'm also Hopi on my father's side. That's my mother's side, which I principally follow. But also I've been initiated into Hopi society, and so I'm very I'm very grounded in both of my cultures, both of my nation societies.
Well, people who are watching this have just read your article on the doctrine of discovery, and I wanted to dig right into some of that. At some point you quote Vine Deloria saying that Christians must disclaim using history as a weapon of conquest. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about what that means for you, not just in terms of the article, but in your own life here in the Warm Springs tribe?
Well, I think first of all, look at the major weapon, which is the institutional pillar of racism in the doctrine of discovery. And as you look at how Greek influence has had on Western man and Western society, I think a lot of interpretations and a lot of perspectives that examine racism forget about the roots of institutional racism, going all the way back to the Greeks. And for example, with the Greeks, who of course believe that if you are not a Greek, you're a barbarian. And in turn, when Christianity came into being, Christianity adopted that same principle. If you're not a Christian, then you're a barbarian. And the interesting thing for people of color, my own people as an example, we could, and we did, adapt and accept Christianity to a certain degree, but in that acceptance, we were still never included. There was still an exclusion to our interactions in not only our own society, but in dominant culture society, because we were still less than. We were not less than what, again, looking at the roots of racism, we were still a barbarian. We were still less than the person of dominant culture.
Yeah. You talk also in the article about attending a Christian church as a young person while you were at Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school. How did those two things go hand in hand?
Well, with the education system, if you look historically, the policy of the U.S. government has always been to assimilate Indian people and to, for example, kill the Indian, save the man. And growing up, we had to march to meals, we had to march to school, we had to march to church. And in that, the positive thing was the social interaction among my own peers and among other older Indians, for example, especially the guys that were in high school, because they seemed to have much more freedom and a more positive outlook. And in that interaction, growing up, the safest place I had was not in boarding school or not in church or in school, but away from there. When I went to the Longhouse, or when I was home with my grandmother or my elder aunts and uncles, those are safe places. And so the distinction in the two was always adversarial, because one, certain behaviors were acceptable and the other they weren't. And so growing up, a lot of times it was very confusing, because on one hand you thought, oh, how neat. And I'll give you an example. Growing up, I think when I was in the 4th grade, learned about the coat of arms with becoming knights, and I learned about European monarchs and the history of knights, and I thought, oh, how neat and wonderful, learning about the romanticism of that. And then I thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have my own coat of arms? Well, I started looking for some information to help me see what my coat of arms was. And there wasn't any, because obviously I wasn't European. And then I talked to my dad about that. He says, well, son, don't worry about that. You know, we have our own way of doing things. When we go home, when I take you to Hopi, you can see what our people do, and you can become a Hopi. You can belong to the Rabbit and Tobacco Clan, which is part of who you are, and you will learn and be shown how to behave in the way that Hopis do. So that was part of the contrast that I grew up with. And then the more obvious thing was the behavior. Witnessing the behavior of men, their role in the society, and as well women and girls, and then of course my relationship to them. There were lots of do's and don'ts, of course, but in that interaction, I was guided. I didn't realize at the time, but I was being guided in how to behave in a good way.
You mentioned in that article about the power of your Hopi initiation. What did that entail, and what did that represent for you? Well,
when we made our visit and we spent time at Hopi, and growing up, we made several trips, because obviously back in the late 40s and the 50s, that was quite an undertaking to go from here to Arizona and likewise coming home. So that just the travel was very interesting and eye-waking. But again, ask me your question again, please.
Well, I was asking about, you'd made a reference to your Hopi initiation.
Oh, okay,
and how that was a spiritual well-being for you. And as you brought up your father offering that as a counterpoint to this tension, I'm just wondering, what did that entail, and what did that mean for you?
Well, after we got there and I began interacting and growing a very positive relationship, especially with my grandmother. I was probably closest to my grandmother, but also very close to my grandfather, who were very nurturing. And in Hopi society, of course, grandparents parents don't discipline children. That's left up to the Kachinas. But in finding out about Kachinas and about Hopi society, and then about initiation, in order for me to become, I was told, to become a full-fledged Hopi, I had to go through an initiation process. So my father told me that, and he said, do you want to go through that? Do you want to? Because he gave me a choice, and I said, yes, I do, Dad. So then the following, after deciding that, then my father went to a friend who was not a relative, but a man who he picked as my mentor. And in that choice and that decision, that mentor was responsible then for teaching me how to become a Hopi, not only in respect to the socialization, but the cultural responsibility. So I would not only, once I went through the ceremony, be a Hopi, but also I would be able to participate in Hopi ceremonies, the sacred religious ceremonies in the Kiva, which is the Hopi church, of course, and is a underground, not a building, but an underground room that's built on mesas. And for example, I have a picture here of Walpi, where my grandfather and I, as a youngster, I used to run and play with my siblings all over that. But again, kind of coming back to your question about initiation. Well, when my mentor was chosen, my godfather is how we referred to that person. So when my godfather was chosen, I met him, and then that started the process. So then the very next morning, I had to get up before dawn. My father got me up, and then we went to my godfather's home, and I got introduced to his sisters and all the female relatives on his side, because in becoming going through the initiation, the important thing about that was initiating and becoming, of course, a Hopi. But in that, then you have to go through the ceremony. And again, kind of coming back to the ceremony, my godfather was chosen, I was introduced to the family, and then I was asked to go to the eastern side of the mesa, which the sun comes from, of course, rises. So I had to go, just as the sun was rising, I had to go and sit and kneel and pray and ask the Creator then what I wanted in my life, in my life's work and my life's walk. So as a youngster, I think I was only, 7? I think I was 7 then, or 8. I had some idea that of course, a healthy, happy life was essentially what I was thinking about. And having gifts, getting gifts, of course. So then after my ceremony and my prayer to the Creator, well, then I went back and we sat down to a meal. And so there was a big feast of all traditional Hopi foods, tamales and hominy stew, and just a wealth of different foods. And then I was, I'm sorry, I should back up a little bit. Before I went to the cliff to face the eastern rising sun, they washed my hair with yucca root. And yucca root is a natural cleanser, shampoo. So they washed my hair, and then they gave me Hopi names. I don't remember them because that was so long ago, and I had no way of recording it to remind myself and remember. And then of course, my godfather was very old at that time, and he passed, so I never had any reference. And then, of course, my father had passed not too many years after that. So I really had no reference to go to. So I just had to continually go back to Hopi, and my uncle became my father, my biological father, my father's brother. So he taught me a lot of Hopi tradition. But again, coming back to the ceremony, then once I went through that, I had the meal, there were lots of gifts. They gave me gifts like new clothing and so on. And so after that, then it was within a matter of a few days, then I could go with the men and go begin practicing for a ceremony. Because what happens with the Hopi ceremonies, there's a lot of practice. You go into the kiva, you smoke tobacco ceremonially to cleanse yourself and bless the occasion. And then you're able to get into the practice of whatever ceremony, the dance and the song and all that. And you do it, of course, in unison and as you would when you're presenting that to the people. So that was that part of my growing up, and that was very rewarding. The one thing I just might mention that's the irony. In my initiation, I was very fortunate that I got initiated a little different from my father, because when he was a young man, a young person, probably 10 or 11, he got initiated. But back in his day, what would happen is not only the ceremony that I described, but the Hopi boys would be trained for a long distance run. And what would happen is for 4 days they would train, they would get up and have to run. And they had men, their godfathers, their mentors, that would help coach them along. And the idea was, after the 4 days of running and training and preparing and fasting, because there was fasting with that. And on the 4th day then, what they would do is, there was a big, like a mesa. Oh, it had to be about 50 miles away from the village. Well, what they would do then is they would run. Part of the initiation was to run. Get up as the sun rose that 4th day, and then a group of them would all take off and run. And the idea was to run around that butte, which was, and all day, I would imagine, that run for the day was probably close to 100 miles that they had to do. So they would start in the morning, and there would be people, young men and boys, coming home midnight and in the morning of the following day, because such a long run. And the idea was, you couldn't run. They would have water that you'd pack, that the helpers, your mentors, packed, and then they had what's called tusi. Tusi is yellow cornmeal, and that's all you could have as you were running. You'd eat that, and then you got thirsty, you would drink. And anyway, that was my father's initiation. So mine was, they took pity on me, I suppose, in the later generations. We weren't quite as tough as our parents or grandparents. So I had a little easier initiation. But from that, then I was able to take part in the dances, and I did, and I have, but I haven't for a long time now, because obviously I don't live at Hopi and where I'm able to do that. But there is so much that I'm grateful for in having that connection and being able to participate. Where I have 3 brothers. Out of the 4 of us, I'm the only one that's been initiated and can take part, because you have to be initiated to take part in the ceremonies. Otherwise, it'd be a sacrilege.
Yeah. You mentioned in there some point about kachinas and learning about kachinas. For the sake of our listeners, what's a kachina?
Well, for example, I have some behind me here. A number of different kachinas, but what kachinas represent are spiritual beings, because in the Hopi belief, all things are connected, all things have life, both animate and inanimate. So kachinas are, you could look at them in Christian faith like deities, but they're more than deities, because they represent those spirits of inanimate and animate in our universe. So they are the ones that carry the message from the Creator, because when they come from their homes, and in Hopi tradition, their home where they come, excuse me, the home that they come from is in the San Francisco Peaks, and they come and visit the Hopis when ceremonies come, and there's a whole cycle of ceremony with the seasons, with the what is it called, when the sun the axis of the sun changes. The solstice, the 4 solstices, they follow that. And so anyway, again, coming back to what Kachinas represent is then they're the messengers that carry the wisdom of the Creator, which is tied again to the connection that Hopi people have with all those animate and inanimate things. So there's that connection. And then, of course, then they bring presents by way of food, because they also help bring rain. They help in helping the men be very vigilant in their life's work, their task of providing food for their relatives, for the females, for the children, for the grandparents, and so on. So the role of the Hopi man is very important in being not only the not the force, but the being, the connection between God and the Hopi people. So they put on the ceremonial garb and then essentially become that spirit, so that they can make that connection between the Creator and heaven, as it were, and us. And then again, the connection with all those things that we have to provide as men to our people. Yeah. And interesting, on my mother's side, with the Taichpam and the women do all the beadwork and make moccasins and make the garb and so on. In Hopi tradition, the men make the moccasins, make the dresses for the ceremonies for both men and women, make the kilts, because Hopi men wear kilts in the ceremony, and so on. So there's that distinction, and also the distinction of in Hopi society is patriarchal, where the women are the leaders in society. Conversely, in my mother's side, on my mother's people, we come from a chieftain, paternal, and that's why I have as my ancestors people like Chief Joseph, who are very close, and then my own grandfather, his father, and fathers, and so on, were all chiefs. But the interesting thing too, his generation, the generation of my grandfather, when you were a chief, you also were what's called a bell ringer today, a religious person, a holy person, where you conduct the ceremonies, the religious ceremonies. So not only are you a leader, political leader, but you were a priest and a holy person that helped people. And you could even be a healer. Because some men had, and women had that skill and were trained to become healers. We call them Indian doctors in English, of course, but yeah, there were those folks. So again, coming back to the Kachinas are the purveyors and the people that mediate God's will and what's on the ground, and that, for example, being connected to the ground.
Yeah. I want to shift, because I want to appreciate some of the work you're doing now around the doctrine of discovery and some of what your mission has been. You described this class you took in 1972 that was really revolutionary for you, and the name of the class was Western Thought and the Racial Oppression of Man. What happened in that class, and what happened to you? And what are its legacies today in your work?
Well, what I learned was the influence that Greeks have had on Western history. And just the idea of Western history is completely void of indigenous history. History didn't start with, of course, Western man. History has been with us from time immemorial. And it's interesting to learn the agrarian society that Western man comes from, and men generally. I think all colors, all walks of life, started out in farming and that kind of community. And as we evolved as men and people, land, of course, became critical. And so you look at dominant culture, land is a pillar to your wealth, to your being, and providing food and taking care of your family and people and so on. But there's no connection to that. And in native people, of course, there's the connection. We are connected to the ground. In our religion, in the Washat, we talk about that connection. One of the things I didn't do that I would like to have done is I would like to have sang a song and made a prayer. Maybe at the end of this, that could be a time we could do that. Because ordinarily when our people are in a situation that's significant to their lives and to the collective lives of whoever's with them, you begin that meeting and the discussion and so on with a song, with a prayer, and then of course the ceremony, whether it's a religious ceremony or a social ceremony or a meeting of government officials and so on, political. You always begin that process with an honoring. That's how we look at when we sing our songs. It's not only honoring ourselves, but we honor you because you're honoring us with coming to us. Another very basic, I think, distinction that I think is important, kind of coming back to something I knew long before I took the class, was, for example, today with the coronavirus, we can't even shake hands. And that's very significant for my people, because when we shake hands, if you look at the palm of your hand runs all the way up to your heart, and from your heart it's an extension to your hand. So when we shake hands, and it's just like so, you shake hands, that's giving of your heart, giving your heart to that person in honesty. Interesting.
But to recapture us and rethread us in, we've been talking about that class you took and its impact on you.
And I kind of got off on another little journey there. Well, kind of coming back to the class, yeah, it was very eye-opening. And there were not only Native Americans, but there were Chicanos. They were people of color in the class, blacks, a lot of black students. And in that experience, not only was it eye-opening relative to the racism and the idea of institutional racism, but it was so rewarding to be able to sit in a class and in a room and interact with other students of color, other people of color, and then to hear some of their experiences, which were very similar, but certainly similar, different in situation, but very similar in experience around what they were going through. So from that experience, then I began looking at, well, what can, what more can be done? And then at that time, then is when I was introduced to Vine Deloria, because he had already written, and his I think his two previous books were part of a kind of a standing reference for us Indian students, because some of the things that he'd written were I guess what would you refer? They were very contemporary in the sense of the issues that we were confronting, not only in respect to historical Western thought and racism, but also relative to our own culture and our own being. And often the misrepresentation that we might have gotten, from our experience, especially when you look at stereotypes, for example, and then the indoctrination. I think that's probably one of the most significant things that I learned is the indoctrination process that people of color, and in my instance, indigenous people, Native Americans, what we had experienced, and that it was something that we could learn about and we could change. So as you ask that question, I think that's probably the most significant thing is, that it's something that could, that we can see now, that I could see. I always wondered, how did we get to where we're at? Where did this originate? And so again, coming back to the Greeks and what their philosophies and their influence was very eye-opening and very good for my growth, my personal growth.
I experienced you as someone who's on a real mission to educate people about the doctrine of discovery and to repudiate it. What do you hope for in that process for Native leaders, many of whom you've suggested are hesitant to talk about this? But I also ask, viewing this are at least 40 churches, congregations, organizations. What would you hope from them in terms of the doctrine and its role?
Well, first of all, I think I'd just like to make them aware of the factual truth of where the doctrine originated, that and the devastation that it's brought. But I think in that process, one of the things that I've learned is there's a lot of apprehension that comes from dominant society because they're threatened just by our existence. For example, growing up and the idea that Columbus discovered America when our people were here to shake hands with him, as it were. So there are those kind of factual things that I think need to be changed. But I think more important than that, we need to begin talking about our differences, but more important, about our similarity. Because in so much of our religious songs, kind of coming back to the Washat, in the parables of the Old Testament, the parables speak to the same kind of words and language that our Washat songs, our traditional songs have. So there's some, that might be a place where would be a starting point. And the thing for me is I'm not a holy man or a holy person that would be called a bell ringer, where I can lead the ceremonies and so on. I'm a follower, but I'm also because of my education, I'm also a studier. I'm a student of what has happened to us in religion. And so I think in wanting to get together, I for a long time I've wanted to get together and create dialogue and create a coalition with a group of people, especially Christians, where we could sit down and begin talking about this. My mother, for example, and my grandmother, who were eclectic, as it were, in their belief. Our father and their father, and then the grandfathers were all, of course, holy men. But an interesting story, oral story of my great grandfather, was when he was a chief on our reservation, just as the reservation was created, over where the old golf course at Canita used to be. There's a clubhouse, and there's a piece of ground there. And back in the day, that was the wintering grounds for my grandfather and his people. And so they had a longhouse built, and they would practice to wash it. Well, as the reservation was getting settled, and see that we come from two different tribes, the Wasco and Warm Springs, and then the Paiutes later. Well, Wasco and Warm Springs have two different sets of values. The Wasco people, their values are very similar to dominant culture. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, work hard, build wealth, excuse me, and so on. Very similar to dominant culture. Now on the other side, then the Warm Springs, collective good is what's important. Religious, the religious ceremonies that tie us to the ground and connect us to one another and to our environment are critical part of that, critical value. And the taking care of the foods, both tribes have a real appreciation for what the Creator has given us and created for us. For example, our roots, our berries, the wildlife, the salmon, the fish, the deer, elk, and so on. All those things that the Creator has provided for us, well, we also have to take care of those. So it isn't, again, the connection, where it's a reciprocal relationship. So that's consistent with both the Wasco and Warm Springs. But growing up, I'll give you a little bit example of my growing up. My grandmother, my Warm Springs grandmother, would tell me growing up, stay away from those Wascos. Those Wascos are stingy. All they want to do is work. They don't do anything else. They just want to have money. They don't sleep. All they do is count their money. Well, then, and incidentally, I'm both Wasco and Warm Springs, Teichpum and Waskopum. I'm come from both. And then on the other side, stay away from those North Enders, those Warm Springs. All they do is they sing and dance and they play, and that's all. They're lazy. Well, I thought about that growing up, and I thought, geez, I've been pretty lucky, I think. I'm lazy and I'm stingy. So, anyway, give you an example of the distinction in the two tribes. But I think I've still become very healthy. I can laugh at both, and that's part of our native culture too, is humor. Especially when you go in the longhouse. I mean, a longhouse too, but in the sweat house.
Yeah.
Men's humor, of course, like women's humor. Yeah, there's a lot of laughing, and besides the praying and giving thanks and honoring and so on.
I appreciate what you're saying, talking about the two different groups and their conceptions of one another, and likewise, so much more with the dominant culture, with Christian culture, let's say. You mentioned the desire for this kind of dialogue and to talk about the doctrine, talk about how worldview has shaped. But it is scary for a lot of people to create that dialogue. There's a hesitancy to look at it directly. Yeah. Would you offer advice to people of faith in different parts of that state about how to start that kind of dialogue? Well, I think we would... I like I mentioned, I think if we look at the words of the parables, for example,
and then look at the words of our songs. There, I think if we began with like Ilachaichacha, the lighting the way, just as an example. I'm sure I'm almost certain in Christian belief you believe in lighting, creating a light and lighting the way as well. Because I can think of the hymns I sang. I think there were words like that back when I was in boarding school. So yeah, that would be one place. But the other another example, and this is something I do when I have my sweat ceremony, my sweat house. I've invited Christians and non-Indian friends to come in and share with me and go into the sweat house. And what we do is we heat rocks. They're like the sauna, of course, but how we traditional way we do it is we heat rocks till they're white hot practically. Then we put them inside in the old days it was a dome, a willow dome covered, and then you put the rocks in there, and then you have water and you splash water to create the vapor and the cleansing. And the interesting part about it, it's not only for cleansing, but also it's for connection with the Creator and with one another. Again, the idea of honoring. You honor me and I honor you, and we pay honoring to the Creator when we go in there. So we go into the sweat house and it's completely dark because we close the door, and that helps more in getting the connection amongst ourselves and with Grandfather, because it's completely dark. Sometimes there have been people, I haven't experienced this, but we'll hear songs or hear people speaking or things like that where there's another presence, and it can become very powerful because you're cleaning your body, you're cleaning your mind, and you're cleaning your spirit. And then we go in and we honor one another by saying prayers and by singing our religious songs, which again come as an example, the Ilachai Checha. Let me, I wonder now if it'd be a good time to go ahead and I'll do what I hope to as an opening. And I will sing a song, and then I have a short prayer. I Anapanami elachai chai, Anapanami elachai chai, Anapanami elachai chai, Anapanami elachai Anapaname elachai chai. Anapaname elachai chai. Anapaname elachai chai. Anapaname elachai chai. Oh, yeah. Nami pyap kunami psht. Our brother and the father of our brother. I come to you today to bear witness and to give thanks in the honoring of being able to have the time and the place to share my writing, my thoughts, my heart with new relatives, with friends who have come to give a picture of what I'm trying to do and how, Grandfather, I want to help bring us together. Grandfather, there's so much division, so much racial strife, so much differences that are in our world today, especially with what is happening with the leadership of this country, of the United States. Grandfather, I pray that when my new friends, when my new relatives, when in Minaimoma, my relations, when they see this and hear this, that it will begin opening their hearts and their minds to looking at how we differ, but more important, how we are similar to one another. Because Grandfather, I know in your teaching, we only have one religion, one Creator. There may be lots of different ways to believe and to practice, but there is only one Creator, Grandfather, and I thank you. I thank you for honoring me and honoring us in this way that I can carry this and feel very good about being open and with a good heart when I speak to in Minaimoma, to my new friends. So I'll stop right there, Grandfather, with my prayer and wish for goodness and for honoring, not only honor myself as I honor the people that I talk to in this, but I hope, Grandfather, with all my heart, that we can have a conversation, that we can talk, and that we can start with seeing the goodness and togetherness and how we are connected, Grandfather. Connected not only to one another, Grandfather, but connected to all of the universe, all of the animate and inanimate. And that in of itself, that connection is a starting point for all of us. Klaukush. Oi! Komish.
Thank you, Sal.